All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. It is wonderful to have you with us, whether you're in person here in Frankopan Hall, or if you're joining us online from wherever in the world you are. I'm Molly Becker, and I'm the program manager here at the Intellectual Forum, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce this evening's event, reflecting on the 9/11 attacks and their resonance today, almost 25 years later. This is a topic with particular meaning for me, as I'm originally a New Yorker. I was only 6 in 2001, but as I'm sure many, if not most of you this evening do, I have very distinct memories of September 11th and grew up understanding that the events of that day had profoundly impacted the world I was growing up in. So to speak to that impact, I'm very pleased to welcome Barbara Grewe this evening at the IF. Barbara is one of the 5 members of the inaugural cohort of the Cambridge Better Futures Scholars that we are very lucky to have based here at Jesus College. In her time here at Jesus, Barbara is drawing on her own professional experience and the academic resources here at Cambridge to examine the intersection of national security, economic security, and cybersecurity. As I'm sure you'll get a very good sense of this evening, Barbara has quite the career to draw on. Recently, she has focused on international cyber capacity building. She has also been particularly focused on improving coordination between government agencies and government in the private sector, with an emphasis on breaking down barriers to effective information sharing. Before this, she served for 16 years in the US government, including as a senior counsel on the 9/11 Commission, which she'll be speaking to us about today. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Grewe.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm honored that you've chosen to spend your evening here with me this evening. I hope you will find it time well spent. Although some of you may not have been born or were quite young when the 9/11 attacks happened, my keen sense of perception here suggests that many of you were alive then, and probably have very vivid memories of when you learned about the attacks on that day and the following days. I certainly remember it very vividly. September 11, 2001 was a spectacularly beautiful morning in the eastern United States. The sky was that beautiful deep blue, not a cloud to be seen, a little bit of crispness in the fall air that says, oh, fall is coming. It's the kind of day when you're thinking, all is right with the world. This is good. In a very short time, however, we learned all was not right with the world. That morning, 19 men cleared airport security at 3 East Coast airports and boarded 4 transcontinental flights. They hijacked the planes and turned them into guided missiles. They defeated all the security layers that American civil aviation had in place to prevent a hijacking. We were 0 for 19 that day. In a span of less than a few hours, nearly 3,000 people were killed. Once the immediate shocks of the attacks was over, people wanted answers. How could the world's most powerful nation be so savagely attacked by 19 men whose only weapons were small knives and complete fanaticism? And importantly, could we have prevented the attacks? The questions were many and troubling. The 9/11 Commission, more formally known as the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, was created to answer these questions and provide guidance for moving forward so as to prevent similar attacks from happening again. It was not a smooth process to create the commission. The White House was concerned about a possibly critical report coming out shortly before the next election. But the families of the victims refused to stand down. They demanded a commission be established. They wanted to know how their family members died. They kept coming to Washington. They would camp out in front of the doorways of their members of Congress. They would go to the White House. They went to the media. They would not stop. And so finally, through this powerful demonstration of what average citizens can accomplish, the White House finally relented. And on November 27th, 2002, just over a year after the attacks, President Bush signed the law creating the commission. The clock started ticking and the commission had 18 months to complete its work. The law specified there would be 10 commissioners, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. Perhaps the thinking was that this would create a stalemate and the commission would be an utter failure. Initially, the White House selected Henry Kissinger to be chair of the commission, and George Mitchell was named as vice chair. But due to Kissinger's unwillingness to divulge his client list, which was suspected to have a few key Saudi leaders on it, and Mitchell's unwillingness to leave his law firm due to possible conflicts of interest, Tom Kean, the former governor of New Jersey, and Congressman Lee Hamilton were named chair and vice chair. And these choices proved critical to the success of the commission. We ended up with over 80 staff. One notable thing about the staff is, unlike many commissions, the staff here were not hired by individual commissioners. We were a professional, not a political staff. No one asked me what my political persuasion was when they interviewed me. They just wanted to know, can you do a good investigation? And because of that, that meant the staff was free to go and investigate wherever the evidence took them and pursue the issues they thought were important. It also meant the staff could press back if they thought the commissioners were going in the wrong direction on a particular issue or on particular evidence. It kept the process honest and balanced. The commission's job was twofold. First, write the authoritative history of the attack, how and why it happened. And second, to make specific recommendations on what the government should do to prevent further attacks. The mandate was sweeping. Anything related to the terrorist attacks on 9/11 were fair game, including those intelligence communities, the White House, law enforcement, diplomacy, immigration, terrorist financing, whatever the commission thought fit and relevant. The commission had teams fanning out across the country, indeed across the world, to get answers to the important questions. In all, we reviewed approximately 2.5 million documents and conducted over 1,200 interviews. We received countless briefings. Now, we then wrote this report. Now, how many of you have read any part of this report? Oh boy, come on. You can even get it for free online. What are you waiting for? Come on. It's really actually quite interesting. Okay, so one important fact about this, it was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 12 weeks, even though you could download it for free. We sold millions of copies of a book you could get for free. Everybody on the beach that summer was reading the 9/11. I mean, that showed, on the beach, everyone had this. They might have been reading something in between, but they had the book out there, right? Because you had to be cool. Unfortunately, I didn't get any royalties for the fact that we sold millions of copies. I recommend just even going and reading chapter 1, We Have Some Planes. It provides a blow-by-blow account of what happened the morning of 9/11 as the hijackers take over the planes. The chilling calls made by people on the planes saying their last goodbyes. The actions taken by the government as the events unfolded. I find myself reading that chapter again and again, and as I turn the pages, I somehow keep hoping that maybe it will turn out differently this time. The chapter I specifically focused on was chapter 8, The System Was Blinking Red. And you might want to read that chapter just because the fact of 99% of what's in it used to be top secret, secure, compartmentalized information. You can feel like you're getting almost WikiLeaks, for gosh sakes. But for those of you who found the 600 pages of the report a little too daunting, let me recommend an alternative. We have the graphic adaptation of the 9/11 Commission report. It's only 133 pages. It's lots of pictures. So maybe that will be something that you'll want to read. The staff was primarily divided into teams assigned to particular topics. So for example, for the first 5 months, I led the team investigating the FBI. I interviewed people at every level of the FBI, including the director. In October, I assumed a new role, Senior Counsel for Special Projects. This involved leading investigations that didn't fit neatly into the team structure that had been created. So I worked on the missed opportunities to stop the plot, particularly emphasis on the story of Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar, who were two of the muscle men on the plane that flew into the Pentagon. That was particularly personal for me because I had a friend on that plane. So I was investigating my friend's murder. I also looked closely at the story of Moussaoui. You may have heard of him. He was the guy in Minneapolis who was trying to learn how to fly a plane, but he didn't want to learn how to take off and land. He just wanted to be able to fly a 747. I looked at the administration's response to all the warnings received throughout 2001, regarding an impending attack, and the creation of an artificial wall between law enforcement and intelligence information and operations. And that wall created one of the really interesting challenges during the commission because the then Attorney General claimed that one of the commissioners was responsible for creating that wall. I had to interview one of my bosses under oath. It's nothing like saying, "Okay, honey, raise your right hand. I got some questions for you. You do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." The commission conducted some very significant interviews to determine what went wrong and why. Some of the heavy hitters we interviewed included President George Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, former President William Clinton. We also interviewed national security advisors, secretaries of states, attorney generals, FBI directors, CIA directors, including Condoleezza Rice, Richard Clarke, George Tenet, Donald Rumsfeld, Bob Mueller, Janet Reno, Louis Freeh. The commission made numerous factual findings, far too many to report here tonight, but here's some highlights. First, the plot. The mastermind of the plot was someone known as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM. He began thinking about attacking the United States when his nephew, Ramzi Youssef, returned to Pakistan after the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. Seeing the failure of the World Trade Center to collapse from the truck bomb, KSM realized bombs can be problematic. In that case, when the bomber drove into the garage at the World Trade Center, there was a particular spot they had calculated as the ideal spot for the explosives to cause the most damage. In golly, New York parking. He gets in the garage and someone else is parked in that spot. So the fact he couldn't park there probably saved lives and saved a lot of damages. The other interesting thing is, of course, the bomb went off. The van that the bomb was in was just bits and pieces of field debris. And they managed to find a piece of metal that had the vehicle identification number on it. So they could trace it back to a particular rental car. But the person who rented it, clearly not a genius, went back to the car rental agency to claim the vehicle had been stolen and wanted his deposit back. Lesson, don't be a cheap terrorist. KSM began thinking of planes as weapons when he was working on the so-called Bajinka plot, which was a January 1995 plan to simultaneously explode a dozen planes over the Pacific Ocean. Fortunately, that plot was discovered by a local policewoman in Manila, because while they were trying out the explosives in this apartment, there's smoke spewing out the windows, and this policewoman says, something's not right. Went in there, the plot was thwarted. By the way, this same plot was resurrected in the UK in 2006, and this latter plot is the one that's responsible for you not being able to take liquids with you on the plane. KSM originally planned the 9/11 operation to involve 10 planes, 5 on the East Coast, 5 on the West Coast. 9 of them would crash, but KSM would land the last plane at a US airport, kill the male passengers, and then make a speech. Even bin Laden wasn't buying that idea. But in March or April 1999, bin Laden summoned KSM to Kandahar to say he would support what became known as the planes operation. This evolved into the plot involving the 4 planes that unfolded on 9/11. We also learned a great deal about Al-Qaeda. First, it's adaptable. KSM originally identified 4 pilots, but 2 of them were Yemenis, so they couldn't get US visas, so they couldn't come into the country. The other 2 were Saudis and easily received visas, but they couldn't fly planes. They were terrible at it. They had to be replaced. They became muscle men on the plane that went to the Pentagon. Second, Al-Qaeda was patient. They planned operation years in advance, and when original dates did not work out, they changed them. For example, they originally planned to attack the USS Sullivan's warship from the United States in the port of Aden in Yemen, but the small boat they had to carry the explosives out to attack the ship sank. And then they had this crazy moment when all these local fishermen saw packages in the water and started pulling them up, and they were explosives. It wasn't a really good scene. But they were smart. They got a stronger boat, and then they went after the USS Cole in October 2000. They also delayed the 9/11 attacks. They were originally going to happen in May, but they decided they weren't ready yet, and so they waited. And they wanted to wait until after the summer, when more people would be coming back into Washington and Congress starting again. But we also learned Al-Qaeda wasn't perfect. They made mistakes. The question is, could we have stopped them? It's impossible to say for certain, but not out of the realm of possibility. There were numerous missed opportunities to possibly thwart the plot. We knew in advance an attack was likely. We had so many warnings over the course of 2001 that a spectacular attack was coming, but we didn't know for certain what the warnings meant. The drumbeat of reporting regarding a potential attack by Al-Qaeda began in March 2001. There were reports that bin Laden was planning multiple operations. By May, it was reported that the bin Laden network plans were advancing. A walk-in to the FBI claimed there was a plan to launch attacks on London, Boston, and New York. A phone call to a US embassy warned bin Laden supporters were planning an attack in the US using high explosives. The threat reporting surged in June and July. In June, there was intelligence KSM was recruiting people to travel to the US to meet with colleagues already there to conduct attacks on bin Laden's behalf. There was intelligence regarding a possible suicide attack on a US target in the near future. There was reporting of possible near-term spectacular attacks that would result in numerous casualties. There was reporting bin Laden's sponsored attacks were imminent. The attacks were going to be a severe blow to the US interests. The next weeks will witness important surprises. Something very, 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 very big was about to happen. In late June, a briefing was prepared saying bin Laden was planning high-profile attacks that could have catastrophic consequences. There was reporting that Al-Qaeda members thought the upcoming attacks would be spectacular, qualitatively different than anything they had done to date. I could go on. We took actions in response to these warnings. We moved the Fifth Fleet out of harm's way. We removed the USS Cole bombing investigators out of Yemen. We closed the US Embassy in Sana'a. But we took no action domestically. Despite Richard Clarke's warnings, despite an August 6th presidential daily brief telling the president that bin Laden wanted to attack in the United States, and human intelligence saying KSM was recruiting a team to conduct an attack in the US. We had no domestic plan. Partly, this was due to the internal government divide and how threats are handled. By its charter, the CIA looks outside the US. The FBI looks inside the US. The White House National Security Council felt that domestic threats, not their responsibility, but rather belonged to the Counterterrorism Security Group, a lower level group in the White House. Yet when this group held a meeting with domestic agency representatives on July 5th to discuss these elevated threat levels, the domestic agencies were not tasked with any actions. They were not given a plan. They were specifically told they could not go back to their agencies and share this information with everyone else in their agencies. And as a result, nothing happened domestically. As one witness told us, the agencies operating overseas had a playbook. The domestic agencies had no game plan, and no one told them to create one. As a result, the domestic agencies never mobilized in response to the threat. They did not have direction. They did not have a plan to institute. The borders were not hardened. Transportation systems were not fortified. Electronic surveillance was not targeted against a domestic threat. State and local law enforcement were not marshaled to augment the FBI's effort. The public was not warned. The commission concluded that as a result, the September 11 attacks fell into the void between foreign and domestic threats. Foreign intelligence agencies were looking for foreign threats to US interests overseas. Domestic agencies were waiting for evidence of a domestic attack from sleeper cells in the US. No one was looking for a foreign threat to domestic targets. And as a result, when we realized in August of 2001 that 2 al-Qaeda operatives were in the US, no one put 2 and 2 together and thought maybe they were there to carry out the threats that we've been talking about since March. It is important to remember that intelligence is not an exact science. We generally do not receive a copy of our adversary's plans on a silver platter in advance. I like to think of it more like a jigsaw puzzle. But you don't have that nice lid with the picture that tells you what it's supposed to look like. And secondly, lots of pieces are missing. And in this case, not everyone agreed what it was supposed to look like. As I like to say, the FBI and CIA looked at the world through different lenses. And it's only when those different lenses are brought together do we get a 3D version of reality. But that just didn't happen prior to 9/11. The commission identified 10 operational opportunities that the US government missed to intercept at least some of the players. Let me highlight several of them. In January 2000, the CIA failed to watch list Khalid al-Midhar or notify the FBI that Midhar possessed a valid US visa. So around the millennium, the CIA learned that Midhar, who was known to be an al-Qaeda operative because he was connected to what we call al-Qaeda's central switchboard in Yemen. There was a phone number that they all used to plan all the attacks. This guy was connected to it. So yes, let's just say we knew he was al-Qaeda. But we didn't have the CIA tell the FBI, oh, this guy has a US visa. There was nothing to stop Midhar from hopping on a plane and waltzing to the US, which he eventually did twice. In fact, KSM was upset that Midhar left the US because at one point he wasn't so sure he wanted to be part of the plans. But And they were concerned that might be some complications because he actually had to get a new visa. So even though there were parts of the intelligence community that knew he had a visa and was an Al-Qaeda operative, he was able to get a new visa and come back into the United States on July 4th, 2001. In March 2000, the CIA did not watch list Nawaf al-Hazmi or notify the FBI when it learned not only did Hazmi also have a valid US visa, he had flown to Los Angeles on January 15, 2000. His name pops up on the radar when it's learned after the fact he was on a flight manifest to LA. By the way, if anyone had examined the manifest at that time, they would have noticed, oh, Midhar was on that same flight. They ended up living in San Diego, get this, in the home of an FBI informant. Can't make this stuff up. Get listed telephone numbers, register a car, and take flying lessons. None of this additional information is detected until after the attacks because no one knew to try and find them. In May 2001, a CIA official again misses an opportunity to notify the FBI about Midhar's visa, Hazmi's US travel, or a guy named Khalid bin Atash who attended these meetings in Kuala Lumpur with these other guys around the millennium. In May, the drumbeat of threats had gotten so loud that it was decided to have an analyst go back, look through the intelligence trail to see if anything was missed. An analyst rediscovered all of that key information, but once again, didn't share it with the FBI. And remember, the CIA does not have authority to operate within the US. They've got to give that information to the FBI to do this, take action. In June 2001, FBI and CIA officials do not ensure that all relevant information regarding the Kuala Lumpur meetings was shared with the USS Cole bombing investigators at a June 11 meeting. So here there's a meeting in Washington, D.C., where there's an FBI analyst, some FBI agents investigating the Cole bombing, and they meet to share some photographs and information regarding potential connections between the Kuala Lumpur meeting attendees and the Cole bombing suspects. It just so happens that a CIA analyst asked to come along to the meeting and was sitting in the meeting. He hears the FBI people discussing the Kuala Lumpur meetings and some of these key players. He knows about the visas. He knows about the travel. But no one asked him what he knew about these people, and he didn't believe it was a responsibility to volunteer it, even though he knew about it all. It just didn't think it was his job. In August 2001, the FBI did not recognize the significance of the information that Hazmi and Midhar are in the United States or make any connection between these facts and the threat of imminent attacks, and therefore doesn't take adequate action to share information, assign resources, or give sufficient priority to the search. So an FBI analyst finally learns that Hazmi and Midhar have entered the US. It is now August 22nd. The clock is ticking. The analyst takes some action to see if they can be located. But due to a confluence of misunderstandings regarding this perceived wall between law enforcement and intelligence, this request to search for Hazmi and Midhar goes up to the New York field office. One of the Cole investigators sees the information, calls the analyst to figure out, okay, what can we do about this? And the analyst tells the agents, oh, you're not an intelligence agent. You can't look at this. You need to delete this. You cannot do anything. Instead of immediately going up the chain of command, the agent decides what he's going to do is just scream at the analyst, say someday people are going to die, and they will be asked whether they've done enough to stop them. But he doesn't take action. And the task gets assigned to a brand new intelligence agent for whom this is his very first intelligence lead. He does the bare minimum and fails to find the telephone numbers that are actually in phone books. This is back when they had real phone books. The registered card that had been recently seen in a nearby state, or any of the other available information. No one is thinking, 2 al-Qaeda operatives in the US, lots of warnings of impending spectacular attacks. Maybe the two are connected, and maybe this should be elevated to a DEFCON 1 priority. It never went above the level of a squad in the New York field office. It was never raised up the chain up to the director of the FBI. In August 2001, FBI headquarters does not recognize the significance of the information regarding Moussaoi's training beliefs. He's the guy who doesn't want to land or take off a plane. So they don't take adequate action to share information with high-level officials across agencies, or obtain information regarding Moussaoi's ties to al-Qaeda, or give sufficient priority to what Moussaoui might be planning. The agents in the FBI Minneapolis field office thought there was enough derogatory information regarding Moussaoui to obtain what's called a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant. This is specifically for foreign agents, not for in the US. But they needed approval from FBI headquarters for this special kind of warrant. The people at headquarters, however, disagreed and refused to authorize seeking the warrant. The agents in Minneapolis said they were just trying to prevent Moussaoui from flying a plane into the World Trade Center. The headquarters team replied, he wasn't going to do that. Well, they were right on one thing. He wasn't going to fly a plane into the World Trade Center. But they were wrong to think that no one else was planning to do it in a short time. In the end, time ran out. Critical pieces of the puzzle were on the table, but people were not working together to solve it. It is important to understand that none of the failings that I've just described, or any of the others in the 9/11 report, had to do with technology. They were due to ingrained agency cultures, perceived but not actual policies, the lack of supervision of junior people, and some just bad luck. I want to briefly address the raft of conspiracy theories regarding the attacks. It has been argued that the mis and disinformation regarding the attacks was the first instance of using conspiracy theories to undermine the legitimacy of the government. One particular theory that I despise was a claim by an individual who worked for a legitimate broadcast news company, who said to me, it was not a plane. It was a US government missile that went into the Pentagon. When I recovered from my shock, I asked him, how could he possibly believe that? He said, well, if it was a plane instead of a missile, why wasn't there any video of a plane hitting the Pentagon? I replied, well, in fact, there is video of the plane. There were plane parts on the scene. There was jet fuel in the lungs of some of the survivors. There was radar showing the plane flying from Dulles Airport to the Pentagon. And lastly, if it wasn't a plane, then where on earth was American Airlines Flight 77 and the 64 people who were on the plane, including my friend Barbara Olson? Of course, these facts did not shake his completely bonkers theory. If you are interested in more of these conspiracy theories and the debunking of them, there's an excellent popular mechanics publication addressing the claims called Debunking the 9/11 Myth, including the idea that the US government put explosives inside the World Trade Center to make them collapse. Of course, just interviewing people and reviewing documents was not the end goal of the commission. We needed to write a report. And very early on, there were key decisions to be made. First, there would only be one report, not a classified version and an unclassified version. We felt the central purpose of the commission was to write a report for the public. And this meant unclassified, as the average reader does not have top secret clearances. But issuing an unclassified report is challenging. The materials relied upon were highly classified. As I mentioned, Chapter 8 is basically very highly classified originally. So it had to be declassified before we could make it public. There were negotiations regarding declassifying content until the middle of the night before we sent the publication to the printer. Second, we decided the report would be widely available in bookstores everywhere. This meant we had to find a private publisher who could make it happen. But that also meant that we negotiated the length, the covers, and many other details before the first word of the report had been written. So I knew how long the report was before I'd written any part of it. So this led to lots of interesting challenges, including hard decisions about what was left in and what was left out, so we could maximize the amount of content. And so if you look at the report, you'll see that the margins are quite small, and the type of the footnotes really, really tiny. You might need a magnifying glass. But there's lots of really interesting stuff in those footnotes. Third, the report had to be readable. No bureaucratic gobbledygook. It had to be interesting and draw the readers in. Finally, fourth, there was a tight deadline established in the original legislation creating the commission. We could have kept investigating for many more months. We could have used more time for the writing process. We could have used more sleep. But we finally got a 2-month extension. But in the end, the commissioners had to approve the report. Now remember, I said they were evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. So this was one of the most amazing moments of the commission. I was in the conference room in mid-July 2004 when the commissioners voted unanimously to approve the final report. No dissents, no vetoes, no abstentions. 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, each of whom had led very political lives at the opposite ends of the political spectrum. It was incredible to watch that vote. The commission found that the 9/11 attacks revealed 4 kinds of failures: imagination, policy, capabilities, and management. In finding there was a failure of imagination, the commission concluded the US government took the threat seriously, but not in the sense of mustering anything like the kind of effort you would normally confront an enemy of the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd rank. At a fundamental level, we didn't think that anyone would be foolish enough to attack us. Our psychology had always been we were protected by 2 vast oceans. We have friendly neighbors to the north and south. What was there to fear from some crazy guys who lived in caves in remote, impoverished countries? There were so many of the kinds of things that they just didn't imagine, like an aircraft could be used as a weapon, despite the fact that Tom Clancy, 7 years earlier, published a novel where a disgruntled pilot flew a plane into the US Capitol. The commission also found failures in policy. So we had opportunities to mobilize against bin Laden, but we didn't take them. We had as the report talks about, 4 specific instances where mobilization would have been made sense. But they just thought, you know what? Al-Qaeda hasn't killed that many Americans. We couldn't possibly do a major intervention. It would be disproportionate. And that a full invasion of Afghanistan before 9/11 was practically inconceivable. The third failure was lack of capabilities. Before 9/11, the US government tried to solve the Al-Qaeda problem with the same government institutions and capabilities it used in the last stages of the Cold War. The CIA took the lead before 9/11 and prepared long-term offensive plans against the enemy. It used covert action, but the cadre was small, and the CIA did not seek an expansion. Contained in the report are 6 or 7 possible opportunities the CIA developed to capture bin Laden prior to 9/11, but they did not exploit them. At no point before 9/11 was the military fully engaged in the mission of countering Al-Qaeda. We paid a very high price for keeping counterterrorism policy within very restricted circles. The most serious weakness was agency capabilities were in the domestic arena. The FBI focused on law enforcement specific cases. It didn't go for collective intelligence. The FAA didn't have fly list. Only 16 people were on any kind of no-fly list before 9/11. Immigration and Nationalization Service failed to recognize that 14 of the 19 hijackers who came into the US had bad immigration documents and shouldn't have been allowed into the country. And finally, there was a lack of adequate management. Hazmi and Midhar, two eventual 9/11 hijackers who had been linked to previous al-Qaeda attacks, had been watched by intelligence officials in Kuala Lumpur in July 2000. The trail was lost, the search abandoned, key opportunities not taken. The FBI and the CIA did not see themselves as part of the same team, and in any event, there was no quarterback. And then in the intelligence community, there was no one in charge. The director of Central Intelligence lacked authority. He could not move resources and personnel across the intelligence community. In December 1998, the CIA director issued a memo that said, "We're at war," but nothing really changed. In the commission's investigation, it could not determine who, in fact, was in charge of the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Based on these findings, the commission made 41 recommendations for government reform. It called for the greatest overhaul of the U.S. security apparatus since the National Security Act of 1947. This included creating a director of national intelligence to coordinate across the 18 members of the intelligence community, and a national counterterrorism center where individuals from across the community could work together and access the full breadth of available intelligence. In December 2004, a mere 4 months after the report was issued, Congress passed and President Bush signed the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. The act was a sweeping overhaul of the intelligence community. In 2007, the implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act was enacted. It was a comprehensive package designed to enact the remaining security and intelligence reforms recommended by the Commission. With that, 40 of the 41 recommendations had been enacted. The sole recommendation, reform of Congress, still has not been enacted. It is tempting to say this is history. We have new challenges. We don't have time to look backwards. But as Winston Churchill said, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Sadly, the lessons learned that I previously described, lack of imagination, lack of policy, lack of capabilities, and lack of management, are just as applicable today as they were in 2001. Do we have a unity of effort across the whole of government rowing in the same direction? Or are individual agencies focused inwardly on their own missions and intelligence? Are we being proactive or just reactive? Are we focused on the most important threats? This is true not just in the counterterrorism realm. In the cybersecurity realm, we are facing not a summer of threat, but years of actual attacks. Unlike 9/11, where we were not certain what the attacks would look like and where they would occur, we are seeing hundreds of thousands of attacks on government, on critical infrastructure, on businesses large and small, and on everyday citizens. Ransomware attacks are shutting down pipelines and healthcare systems. Malware is being inserted in critical infrastructure, including key communication networks. The recent attack on Jaguar Land Rover alone is reported to have caused a 2.9% decrease in UK's GDP. Are we prepared for a cyber 9/11? We need to use our imagination to understand what our adversaries are capable of. We need to create a stronger network of policies to address the changing threat and vulnerability landscape. We need to build our capabilities to protect against an entire array of attacks. And we need institutional management to ensure action is taken. As I mentioned, government by nature is reactive, not proactive. But as the constant assault we are under makes clear, the time for action is now. We cannot wave the proverbial magic wand and poof, the world is safer and government works how it should. No laws are self-executing. They require people to carry out the work. Indeed, one of the most important lessons I believe from the 9/11 story is not one of the official findings of the Commission. Rather, it is the importance of people, specifically leadership and cooperation. As I mentioned, there were 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats intended to ensure the Commission failed, but it did not. because of the leadership of Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton. When they were named to replace the original chair and vice chair, Tom called Lee and declared they were co-chairs, not chair and vice chair. Lee, who was a former member of Congress, where being chair versus vice chair really mattered, was stunned, but they carried it out, never appearing in public alone and never allowing daylight between them. When one of the Sunday news programs invited Tom to appear, he replied that he would, but only if Lee was sitting next to him. The producer replied in a huff, "Guests do not decide who appears on the program." So Tom said, "No, I'm not coming." A few days later, they called back. Tom and Lee appeared on the program. This continued leadership throughout the commission helped the other members get along and indeed become friends. Without this leadership and erasing party lines, it is inconceivable that there would have been a unanimous final report. And when Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman and Republican Senator Susan Collins were handed the reins of drafting and enacting the Intelligence Reform Act, they modeled Tom and Lee's behavior, never talking about the issues separately, staying joined at the hip. Thus, they managed to navigate the shoals of the legislative process that some said went too far and some said did not go far enough. This resulted in enacting sweeping legislation in 4 months' time, completely unheard of in the US Congress. The absence of true leadership in today's politics is preventing us from effectively addressing so many issues. It is time that those in power realize that by finding common ground and doing what is best for all and not a select few will make us all better off and much safer. As is written in Matthew chapter 12, verse 25, and reinterpreted by Abraham Lincoln, a house divided among itself cannot stand. It is time to architect a stronger, unified structure to make the world a safer place for us all. This has just been a high-level overview of the Commission's work. If you're interested in learning more, I recommend there's the PBS documentary titled "Are We Safer Today?", where the commissioners are interviewed about their work on the Commission and the political challenges surrounding their effort. Or you can listen to my podcast of the same name, where my co-host Michael Hurley and I interview key members of the Commission staff to learn some of the inside stories that did not make it into the final report. Thank you for coming. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was absolutely fascinating. We have time for questions now. We'll take some in person here, but also if you're joining us online, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll keep an eye on your questions here and report them back to the room. So, yes.
Hey, Barbara, that was fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for everything you did. We live in a world today where you have Palantir scooping up all the data from around the world, possibly including citizens. Is it making us safer now, or are there new vulnerabilities created by this all-seeing eye?
Well, don't get me started talking about Palantir. But I will say this. One, companies like Palantir and the analytical tools they provide have made us safer. They give us an opportunity to take all kinds of different information and look at it and see different patterns, make connections. I am confident that if Palantir had existed prior to 9/11, these disconnects would not have happened. Palantir is not the only company. There's lots of other companies doing similar kinds of things. All of them have important contributions to make. But I do believe your point that there has to be regulations, privacy, concerns about who gets to see the information is really important. After the failures of the 9/11 story, there were people in the government and elsewhere, these think tanks, who thought, okay, the solution to this is to give all analysts all information at all times. That's a really, really bad idea. And we see that by how many opportunities we've had. We can look at, I'll just pick one, Chelsea Manning, who took actually a Lady Gaga CD into, when he was out in the field in the military, and put it into a computer, downloaded all kinds of documents that she did not have need to see, and then shared that with WikiLeaks. And that caused significant security issues. So I think the idea that everyone having all information at all times does not make sense. But there has to be a way making sure the people who need certain information to do acts get that information. And these tools are important as part of that.
Thank you, Barbara. Is there the proper infrastructure in place today to prevent this kind of event going forward again? And is it sufficient? Has it changed in 25 years?
So the structure that we needed has been put in place. For example, creating the Director of National Intelligence. But again, here's where my point about people matter. So the first Director of National Intelligence was a former ambassador. And when we created the idea of the Director of National Intelligence, we wanted an organization that would break China. But unfortunately, ambassadors buy China, they don't break China. And so he wasn't the right person. It took us several tries, and then we finally got the right person. But then once administrations change, we get new people who may no longer be the right people. More on that I will not say in a public forum. But the fact is, we have to ensure not only are the structures in place, but we have the right leaders who are leading us in the right way. And that we've got the strong partnerships with our foreign partners, because we do not get all the intelligence ourselves. It comes from all of our partners, and we share that information. It's important to keep those partnerships together. And it requires making sure that you've got the right people leading it who have the right instincts and want the right outcomes. The current Director of National Intelligence is Tulsi Gabbard, yes.
I mean, the job that you had to do was to help us learn lessons. And as you said, Winston Churchill said, if we didn't learn lessons, we're doomed to repeat it. I've just read the Afghanistan papers, and it was pretty much generated by a Harvard project called Lessons Learned, based on the CIA reports about Vietnam. And I believe a government at the moment is currently engaging in a regime change in the Middle East. Do you think we actually learn lessons?
There are people who have learned the lessons. We have government structures that are in place to help us take advantage of learning the lessons. But again, if we don't have the right people in place, then we're going to continue to make the same mistakes. And so one of the big mistakes everyone talks about is how we got into this endless Afghanistan war. I mean, one of the things about that was we were winning that war, and it was winnable, and then we took our eye off the ball. And then it allowed Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to regroup, and then we're behind the 8 ball, and that's how we ended up in that lengthy war that we finally just said, we've got to end this. I do fear that we could continue to make those same kinds of mistakes if we don't have people who are knowledgeable, who have studied history, who understand there are consequences to action, who understand that perhaps violating Geneva Conventions could mean that someone else might say, well, if you can violate it, we can violate it too. And so things can play out in ways that if you don't have people who have imagination and understand what the possible consequences are, mistakes will be made.
everybody else is interested in. The chief executive of a US AI company that I shall not mention has thought through levels of threat, some of which amount to existential risks, that of which AI might be capable in 1, 2, 3, 4 years' time. So he has, in essence, prioritized certain levels of threat. What evidence is there that there are government structures who are thinking through the implications of those levels of threat, and what sort of security apparatus might be able to look at them? That's malicious actors using AI.
There are organizations within the various governments that are certainly looking at those issues. Do I feel that there's been given enough attention to the potential? Again, going back to imagination, policy, management. Yeah. I think the fact the whole fight between Anthropic and the Department of Defense is really interesting on that point, where you've got a company saying you cannot use our tools for these particular things. I think it's interesting that the Department of Defense said, then fine, we won't use your tools. But there are certainly other companies that are more willing to not, I think that's a double negative. There are companies that are willing to not put those controls. And I think the fact that if we just ignore the fact that there's reasons why some companies say there should be controls, if we just ignore that, I think that we'll end up with consequences we just didn't foresee. I attended an interesting talk a couple weeks ago by the CEO of Wave, the autonomous vehicles. And the question I asked was, how are you teaching the machines to have judgment? And do you have an ethicist on your staff? And the answer was, no, they don't have an ethicist, and no, the machines don't need judgment. People make mistakes, so machines will make mistakes. Well, frankly, I mean, why don't we make it so the machines make fewer mistakes than people do? Seems like that would be possible. I'm not a technical person. We've got some technical people here who might be able to answer that better than me, but it just seems to me there are things that could be done. Here.
Thank you, Barbara. From your opinion, from having spoken to all these different agencies, CIA, FBI, domestic terrorism, considering just regardless of who's making the decisions right now and how this is happening, but do you think that there is enough staff or capability to deal with all the enemies that are being created right now in the United States?
You mean the fact that we're creating more enemies as we go along?
Right. I mean, how do you keep up? I just don't know. I mean, at the time, they're looking at Al Qaeda. They know there was, Taliban had been there for a while. But now, I mean, in a short period of time, we don't even know how many new enemies are being created daily. And how do they keep up with that and just monitoring this?
Well, a couple things. One is having machine learning tools that can help us do it better, so that we don't rely on individuals to keep all of this stuff in their head. I mean, it used to be that essentially they kept it all in their head, and you could go talk to these people and they would just tell you X, Y, Z, this, blah, X, Y, Z, I guess I should say here. And now you don't have to do that. I mean, you've got machines that can help you take all this information. But do we have enough people? We never have enough people. We can always use more people. And unfortunately, as many of you may have read in the United States, due to particular people that might be called Elon Musk, that a lot of positions were eliminated. And they were not done in a smart way. It was, we're just going to cut these numbers. And the tools that they used to figure out which ones. And I mean, and afterwards they realized, oh, wait, maybe we needed some of those people. And then they tried to bring them back. So the bottom line answer is we don't have enough people. We need help to use technology to help us. And we need to be able to prioritize threats. You know, as you all, these people who are all in the same program as I know, that, you know, I'm really focused on the cyber threat. And particularly as we're watching a number of the things happening around the world, we need to recognize that these countries are very capable cyber-wise, and that they don't have to have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can go all the way to the United States. They can push a button and our power goes out, our water goes out, our banking goes out. Are we ready for that? I don't know. I think there was a question over here.
Thank you. Going back to the run-up of the event itself, I'm a Saudi, I'm a Yemeni, I'm a whatever I am in my mid-20s. I've come over to the States. I've been here some time if I'm taking flying lessons. I've seen another lifestyle. What makes me do it?
I mean, it truly was religious fanaticism that said that the West was evil and that they were going to save the world from the evil West. I think the interesting thing was Khalid al-Midhar, he actually had a girlfriend, so he left the country to go visit his girlfriend, and he was thinking of bailing, but then was convinced to come back and finish out the job. And so I think, and I mean, I didn't go into it tonight, and there's parts in the report that really talk about what they were thinking and why they were thinking and why they hated the US so much that they wanted to destroy it. One of the interesting things is, you know, when they bombed the USS Cole and 17 US sailors died, the US did not take action back against Al-Qaeda at that point in time. I mean, it's an attack on a military vessel. You would expect we would do something. And we didn't. Part of it was because you're in this change, you're about to have a change of administrations and saying, oh, I'll let the new president deal with it. And the new president's like, well, if the old president think you should do it, then whatever. And we learned that bin Laden, after we didn't respond after the Cole attack, said, well, what do I have to do to get their attention? Well, he found a way. And I mean, as Molly said in the opening, I mean, all of our lives, whether you were in the US or not, have been changed dramatically by the 9/11 attacks. I mean, how much of the security you deal with on a day-to-day basis, every time you get on a plane, every time you go through any kind of security, it all goes back to the fact that you've got people who want to hate us.
So we have a question online, actually, if I could jump in, from Stuart. So he asked, do the domestic priorities of current administrations on either side of the Atlantic risk undermining the special relationship needed to perform the collaboration required to prevent what you call a cross-border cyber 9/11?
I think that there are real challenges to our foreign relationships at this point in time because we do not see eye to eye on many things and our interests are not aligned. I do think that one of the things that's really important is that there's this upper level of government that's doing the policy and making a bunch of big decisions. But then you have this entire army of people underneath who often are career civil servants, who have learned lessons and seen things, and they don't care about the politics. They're going to do what's right. And I think one of the interesting things, I mean, we interviewed a bunch of really senior people, but we interviewed a lot of lower level people, and I actually enjoyed a lot of those interviews more because I was learning what it was from the people on the ground who were making decisions and working night and day and doing everything they could. So it's not like we had a bunch of evil people who were a bunch of jerks who didn't care about security. They just didn't have good leadership. They didn't have good ways of doing things. I mean, as Lee Hamilton used to say, you know, bad structures don't necessarily prevent good people from doing the right things, but it's much easier when you have good structures in place. So one of the things was to create the structures to make good things happen. But there are a number of concerns about some of these important relationships around the world, whether you want to talk about NATO or Five Eyes or all of those challenges. And the important thing is to say, okay, are there people who really are working to make sure that things are happening as opposed to getting messed up in that upper level folderol? That's my technical term. I think he's had his hand up for a long time.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the spirit of bipartisanship, which seems to have been essential to the production of the report and the sort of leadership, as you talked about. In today's increasingly polarized and combative world of politics, do you think there's still scope for that sort of bipartisan approach?
Oh, it could happen. Whether it will happen, I think that there comes a swinging point where the pendulum swings so far that people sort of say, oh, wait a minute. And once they realize that their interests are actually aligned with these people, and you can find particular examples on particular issues where they're getting together, but just not at the macro level. It's at the micro level. And I think the fact is we have to stop this world where we've got people making someone of a different party your enemy. So as I talked about the law enforcement and intelligence wall, there was a particular hearing in which the Attorney General accused one of the commissioners of creating that wall. Turns out to be false, but created that and created all this hullabaloo. All the other commissioners rallied behind her and did a unified front. She said she gained 9 brothers that day. But by doing that unified front, they were able to say to the Attorney General, you're not going to divide us. You can't do that to us. We have a mission and we're going to do our mission. So if you're united in mission, those things can happen. But it has to be the personal choices of those individuals who say, yeah. And we can see tons of examples of people who decide not to run for office again, and then suddenly they get a lot of courage. So I think, I mean, part of the political process is that people want to get elected.
Thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting to hear about it as someone who wasn't even a thought during the time that it happened. For my question, had 9/11 been prevented, do you think some kind of similar attack would have still happened even if people had the experience of stopping one from happening already?
That's a really good question. I think that if we had stopped what was planned to be the biggest spectacular attack, they would have had to regroup. And anytime you regroup, it becomes more difficult. I mean, and so we would have known what their plans were. We could have put the security in place. We could have done the kinds of things to help prevent another attack. And we've seen since 9/11, there are a number of public and also not public attacks that have been stopped. But if we had stopped bin Laden on this particular one, I don't know. I mean, if we had stopped him and we knew sort of about who the plots were. So we captured KSM, who was the mastermind. We captured him in 2002, I think. And Ramzi bin al-Shibh, who was another key player. And Ramzi bin al-Shibh said that if they had learned, if they had even known that Moussaoui had been arrested in Minneapolis, they would have postponed the attacks. So, I mean, who knows? It's sort of a chess game. We don't know for sure. But I think it would have been much harder for a similar attack to be done because of the fact we would have known their ways and learned some lessons and done some security changes.
So we have a question from online. It's an anonymous attendee. And they're saying, it's fascinating that the book was published, that the report was published commercially. Where did the funds from the sales go, and how did the graphic novel come about?
Okay. So the funds from, well, first of all, the price of the book was just basically to cover the publishing cost. It was like $6.99 to buy the book. So it's not like the publisher made a ton of profit. They covered their cost. I think that there was some profits, and I think that they went to some of the family members' organizations, but don't quote me on that. But I think they did. But it wasn't like this was a $25 book. I mean, it was $6.99. And I mean, had a lot of paper in it. And the graphic novel, I don't know how. So the guys who did it are these guys named Sid Jacobson and Ernie Colon. And I don't know how they got the idea of it, but they did it. And in fact, there's a foreword in it from Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton, and saying that what a great job that it was. And it is really well done. I mean, in terms of, some of the key information and all of that. And I think the drawings of some of the people are kind of amusing because they don't really know what those people looked like. But it's really well done, and it's a way to understand all the stuff that was happening. I only touched on little tiny things. I mean, there's so much more of what was happening behind the scenes. We had a whole team focused on what the White House is doing. We had a specific team on what the CIA was doing, what NSA was doing, what FAA was doing, what NORAD, the North American Defense, who, by the way, you'll see in the first chapter, you learn that they lied to us about what they were doing, and they claimed that they were in fact responding on the morning of 9/11, but they sent planes out over the ocean when A, the planes weren't coming from across the ocean, and B, by the time they got out there, all the planes were on the ground, including Flight 93 in Pennsylvania. But they sort of tried to tell us a different story. But the facts didn't support that story. We had, on the point of where the information wasn't shared with the FBI, this is one that's really, really painful. There was an FBI agent who was detailed to the CIA, who saw the cable traffic that had the information, but they do not have permission to automatically share information with their own agency, so they had to ask permission. And the person at this particular part of the CIA said no, they could not share that information with the FBI. And a couple hours later, that same person wrote a cable that said the information had been shared with the FBI. I mean, there's just so much stuff. That's why I think the report is worth reading, to really understand how government works, how people work, how decisions are made. And I've got off the end of that question. I've gone off on my tangent, sorry.
No, that was wonderful. We have one more contribution from the online audience, and they want to say thank you for a fascinating talk and for a brilliant lesson in the diplomatic answering of questions. And I think that's a good note to end on. I just want to echo that and say thank you so much, Barbara, for something very fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us here at the Intellectual Forum tonight. We hope to see you back soon. Have a wonderful evening.